was with the G3 people being debriefed when General Gerhardt came in. I gave him the plan of the day and that type of thing, the situation. And he said, that's fine. Now, what can I do for you? I said, well, we are nearly out of ammunition. I had to send, and every other company did the same thing. We sent a patrol down the beach and we robbed the dead of bandoliers of ammunition, rifle ammunition. We picked up any machine gun cans of ammunition, but we still need more. And he turned to his aide and he said, take Captain Raaen down to the ASP, find a vehicle for him that runs, and then load it up with the ammunition he asks for. Anything he asks for, he gets. Don't ask questions.
You are about to embark upon the great crusade
to meet this mounting aggression.
And make no mistake about it, good will prevail.
I'm going to start with the last thing that happened D-Day night. It was very quiet. There was no enemy action around, and a couple of my soldiers from the motor platoon and the communication platoon had found a tennis ball, and they had crossed the road where we didn't have any troops over there, and they were in a yard and they were playing catch. And that's what soldiers do. They find something to occupy their time, and they were having fun playing catch when a dear friend of mine, my company clerk, stepped on an S-mine, a bouncing Betty. I was there watching them play, but I was about 15 to 20 feet away from this mine that I saw emerging. And it rose to head height, and everybody knew they were dead, and it was a dud. So we were going to be very careful of mines after that, because that was a good case of bouncing Betty. But the next morning I was told to take a 4-man patrol out and to clear the channel side of the road of any enemy. And I got the battalion sergeant major volunteered, and the battalion supply sergeant volunteered. He was a master sergeant. And I took one man who might know what he was doing, a corporal, and we went out in diamond formation, and we did. We flushed 2 German stragglers out. Most people called them snipers. They were not. They were stragglers trying to save their own lives. But in any event, we pursued them for over a mile, got in a firefight with them, and then lost them as they melted away over the military crest. So at that point in time, we heard the engines all begin to crank up of the battalion. And our vehicles had come in at midnight. So we had vehicles, and we also had a tank platoon with us. And we heard the engines crank up. We didn't really know what the plans were, but we had a good idea what they were. And so my 2 master sergeants said, my job is there, not here. Goodbye, Captain. So I had Corporal Sharp and I wandered down to the second part of our mission, which was to go to 29th Division headquarters. I knew where it was, and had to go through the German spy routine with all the MPs. And even when I got to the headquarters, I had to prove that I knew who the World Series winner was from such and such a year and all of that junk, which I did happen to know. I don't remember why, but I did happen to know. Anyway, I was with the G3 people being debriefed when General Gerhardt came in. Not Coda, but General Gerhardt, the Major General of the division. He said to me, he knew my father too, and he knew who I was. So he said, Jack, come in here with me. And so I went into his office and gave my report to him. I think there was a G3 operative in there taking notes. And he said, okay. I gave him the plan of the day and that type of thing, the situation. And he said, that's fine. Now, what can I do for you? I said, well, we're nearly out of ammunition. I had to send, and every other company did the same thing. We sent a patrol down the beach and we robbed the dead of bandoliers of ammunition, rifle ammunition. We picked up any machine gun cans of ammunition, but we still need more. And he turned to his aide and he said, take Captain Raaen down to the ASP, find a vehicle for him that runs, and then load it up with the ammunition he asks for. Anything he asks for, he gets. Don't ask questions. So we went down to the beach. We found a vehicle from the S4 of the 58th Artillery, and it worked. We took the gunk off of it. We made sure it was full of gas, which it was, and then we drove it to the ASP and loaded it up with rifle, machine gun, and mortar ammunition. That's about it. So just Sharp and I started off. We went back to Vierville. Everything was quiet. There wasn't a sound in Vierville. All the troops were well down the road. So from my memory, I said, we'll take that road there, and we did. We got to a T. Actually, it was closer to a Y. The map showed it as a T, but it was closer to a Y. And that made me wonder, which is the right one? I went down the left Y, and I found tank ammunition, shells, cartridge cases. I found lots of brass, lots of links, lots of blood, medical kits torn open and things like that. I went down the other one. It had exactly the same thing. So I had to take a guess, and I said, well, my guess is that the right hand will be right. And it was. So we went down that, and we got shot at by stragglers. One of them even hit my helmet with it and spun it into my lap. Well, we wouldn't have gone back for my helmet, I'll guarantee you that, but it hit in my lap, and I put it on, and we proceeded, and we finally found the end of the column as it proceeded toward relieving the 2nd Rangers. We thought that was its mission. Its actual mission was to capture Grand Camp, but all of the Rangers thought we were going to relieve the Rangers at Pointe du Hoc. But in any event, I was now with the Rangers at Saint-Pierre-du-Mont, and Sullivan ordered me to look at the tank positions. We had 8 tanks with us, but 3 of them were out fighting. There were 4 of them in defensive positions around Saint-Pierre-du-Mont. They were in good position. He said, well, we just got a radio call from 29th Division. 29th Division wants the tanks back. So we've radioed to the ones that are out fighting, and they were past Pointe du Hoc. They could actually see Grand Camp-les-Bains. They could actually see it. But they got the radio message, and they came back, and the other 4 tanks with them. And they want me and the lieutenant colonel. And they want me and the lieutenant colonel to come back and consult with them. So goodbye, you have the monkey on your back. Huh? I'm not even the senior officer. But there were enough people who heard it that knew that I was in command. So essentially I called the company commanders in, and the ones that didn't show were actually fighting. So several of them didn't show, but most of them showed, and the ones that did said, I will notify so-and-so because he's there, and I will do this because he's there. And we we coordinated the passwords and the things that you do at night, the impact areas for your machine guns and things, that type thing. But me, I hadn't had any sleep for 72 hours. So I said, well, I'm not any good to anybody, and I went up to the hayloft and fell asleep. But in the process, before I did that, Captain Wise and I thought we ought to send a patrol at least to try and find Colonel Rudder. We thought we owed him that, to let him know we were there. We were in not Grandco, we were in Saint-Pierre-du-Mont, and we would join him in the morning. And they picked the man who I thought was the best ranger in the battalion, Sergeant Willie Moody. He'd been in my platoon in C Company when I was a platoon leader, and he just was the best god non-com we had. And he had a sidekick who always went through him and went with him, and named McKissick. And the two of them went off into the dark during a German counterattack on the Pointe d'Arc. They found their way through the counterattack. They went by Colonel Rudder, and by the time they realized we've gone too far, they came back and found Rudder, gave the report to Rudder, and then of all things, they found a reel of wire, and they laid wire from Rudder back to me, all through a German attack. And both of them got Distinguished Service Crosses for that one. But it was very nice in the morning to go down and say, are Willie and McKissick back? Oh, yes, sir, they're over there. And I went over there and I said, did you find Rudder? And they said, yes, he's on the line. You can talk to him. So I, cold fish, I had to talk to Rudder and tell him what our plans were. And the rest of the battalion came up around, it was certainly daylight, maybe around 6, 7, and essentially used my plan, which was the troops I had in force would assault the enemy troops between us and the point, and the rest of the battalion would take up defensive positions in case the Germans counterattacked from another direction. That was essentially what happened. Colonel Schneider, he was in a Jeep too, by the way, because they'd come in at midnight and so on. And so we were in pretty good shape at that point. On the morning of D+1, the Germans counterattacked a ranger company that was about 200 yards to my left. And they had a little bit of armor with them, but it wasn't tanks. It was more like the armor you throw around an artillery piece because you just don't want the crew to be wounded by small arms fire when they're tending the piece. But it was quite a fight going on, a nice firefight. I could see the individual German infantrymen as they advanced, and I could also see them as they took their casualties. And I looked up. Of course, I'd seen them before, but there were 5 tanks there, U.S. tanks, right on the road beside me, and they were doing nothing. So I went and I climbed up on the tank, and with my M1 rifle, I banged on the turret until the tank commander opened up the turret, and I said, "Can't you guys see there's a battle over there? And I don't know that we're doing well." And he looked, he woke the other tanks up, and they all started firing machine guns. And I said, "Why don't you use your main battery of 76? I think they had 75s at that point. And he said, "It's just too much. We would take more friendly casualties with tank artillery than we are with the machine gun." So they used their machine guns and very quickly extinguished the German counterattack. D+3, we assaulted the Pointe d'Arc Germans, and those that were caught between us, it was a cakewalk. We ran into almost zero resistance. The Germans recognized very quickly that this was a major force, and they pulled out. So we didn't really have any trouble at all relieving the 2nd Battalion. And I was sitting on one of the gun turrets, which had been destroyed, talking with a couple of friends of mine from the 2nd Battalion, when all of a sudden 3 or 4 tanks of the 743rd burst out of the undergrowth to the south of us, and started firing on us with cannon artillery. One man jumped up and picked up the American flag that kept the destroyers from shooting at us and waved it, and they put a bullet hole or a cannon shot right through it. We were taking casualties. Of course, we weren't firing at them, but we were taking casualties because they were firing artillery at anything that looked hostile. And I noticed the motor officer of the 2nd Battalion crossing the ground from where he was, which was to my front about 100 yards, on the dead run. He climbed up on the tank, and with his submachine gun, he beat on the turret until the man opened it up and he says, "This is red on red, stop." So they quit firing immediately. But in the meantime, we had taken 8 casualties. And I think those 8 casualties were in my battalion because the 2nd Rangers still had their foxholes and things like that, and my men had no protection. But I think it was the 2nd Battalion, some of the 5th Battalion's people, that we took 8 casualties, including, I think it was 2 wounded. It was a very unfortunate thing and very understandable. The 2nd Rangers had run out of ammunition. They'd been fighting German counterattacks for 3 days. And therefore, they'd combed the battlefield, and the only ammunition and weapons and machine guns they could find were German. So they were using German weapons and German ammunition. The tankers heard it. We'll go over and help them out. And so they just came guns a-blazing. But it was a very unfortunate situation.
All right, sir, after Normandy in August of 1944, the 5th Ranger Battalion was part of the Battle of Brest in the Brittany area of France. Tell us a little bit about the target there and what the role of the Rangers was.
Okay. When we went into the area, the very first thing that happened was they took 3 Ranger companies and attached them to divisions, and the Ranger company's jobs there were to do the patrolling between 2 divisions. They didn't want the infantry to be patrolling because they might fight each other. So they put us in between to maintain the contact between the 3 divisions that were in the area. I've forgotten what they were. I think they were the 3rd, the 9th, and the 29th. And there was an armored division over on the Crozon Peninsula. So we had lost 3 companies. Later, those 3 companies were drawn together by the battalion executive officer, Major Heffelfinger, and he fought them as a commander of 3 Ranger companies, and it was a very satisfactory arrangement the way it turned out. That left Sullivan, the new commander of the 5th, with 3 companies, and these 3 companies were all attached to the 29th Division. The 29th Division had a solid contact with the next division on the left, but on the right, they had never gotten within, let's say, 2 miles of the roads of Brest, of the harbor. And they told the 5th Rangers, straighten out the lines a bit and get down in contact with the water, because that's where the German forts are. So we did the necessary patrolling with 3 companies, and B Company in particular taking most of the brunt of the action. But we got down there, made contact with the water, and then we started coming back and started rolling up the German forts. Now, the German forts were built in Napoleonic days, so they were all face seaward or harborward. And we were on the flanks and the rear of those forts. And we reduced Fort Tobruk, we reduced Fort Petit Menu, we reduced 5 or 6 forts, capturing them usually with air support from P-47s and occasionally from Lightning P-38s. What we would do was we would go in and we would attack, forcing the Germans into their battle positions. The P-47s would come in and using our smoke would attack the German fort. And Rangers are not afraid of a little dirt that happens to be thrown in their faces as they're moving forward. So we usually were able to capture like 5 times our number. And we reduced something like 7 forts along the southern shore of Brest. Then they moved us over to the peninsula and attached us, and the second Rangers attached us again, still to the 29th Division, but now there was a thing called the Graf Spee Battery, which were 270 millimeter 4 cannon, 3 of which were oriented to sea defense, and 1 of which was oriented to land. Well, those 270s could just destroy anybody, and they were having a ball firing that one gun. And they told us to eliminate those batteries, capture those batteries. Well, it was the first time we got mixed up with the French forces of the interior, the underground. And a couple of our units had very satisfactory use of these troops. Others ran into people who immediately at cocktail hour had to break out the wine and go to bed for the night, that type thing. But make no mind, the French underground did wonderful work, and all over France. I mean, the panzers couldn't reach us because the underground had destroyed the railroads, and the panzers could not move on their tracks because they would break down on their tracks and that type thing. So we were over there now trying to knock out this battery of 4 270 millimeter guns. And I don't know why, but I ended up in command of the battalion. Sullivan was the commander, and if he gave any orders, they were obeyed. But somehow or other, I was the only senior officer left in the headquarters, and we were in contact with the companies. We managed to infiltrate almost an entire Ranger battalion through German lines through a hole no more than 20 feet wide, between 2 machine guns. Nobody wore helmets. They all wore wool knit caps and took off everything that rattled or wrapped it in tape and cushioned it with cotton and things like that. But we got a whole battalion through. And so we were on the other side, inside the German defenses of these batteries. One of our company commanders, A company commander, Ace Parker, and if you know anything about the capture of the Loch Christ battery, the 2nd Battalion officer, Edlin, that's very close to his name. I'm not quite on it right. Edlin had a 4-man patrol, and Parker had about a 2-man patrol, and they met one morning, and Edlin went to the left, and Parker went to the right, and what happened was that Edlin captured the headquarters and the hospitals and the supply buildings of the Loch Christ battery and knocked them out of action. Meanwhile, Parker led the way for the 5th Battalion to actually capture the guns. And I had the great pleasure of calling the assistant division commander at that time of the 29th and say, "We have physically captured the guns."
Now, you had two very close calls during the Brest campaign, correct?
I had to go down to one of our forward companies attacking. And there was a bad curve, which for about 100 meters had complete German observation. You had to go down a straightway straight at a German battery. What you did was there was a nose and a turn. You go up as far as you can without being seen. You make sure everybody is ready to move, and then you go through as rapidly as you can down this road and try to get to the far end before the German observers wake up. I was doing that. We waited, got ready. No other vehicles with us. I had two sergeants in the back of a Jeep and a sergeant driving. No, actually, one of my drivers driving. And he barrels around that corner, and I look up, and there is a clearly coming at me, and I saw him for the last 50 yards, a German 75 millimeter shell coming straight at the Jeep. It hit the hood of the Jeep. The windshield was down, shattered the windshield, bounced up between my shoulders and the driver's shoulders, and between the heads of the two sergeants. The other three all bailed out to the left because it looked to be the logical way to bail out. I bailed out to the right, and I found a ditch, and I was just as dry and comfortable and safe as could be, and they had bailed out into the biggest mud hole in France. They were covered from the top of their heads to include their helmets, everything about them. They just looked like mudmen because they were complete mudmen. And they almost rebelled and threw me in there, but I was as big as any of them, probably bigger than any of them. And I said, if you dare, I will do more than court martial. So I got off with that one fairly nicely. Oh, and the other one was at the headquarters. My shift was over of being the officer in charge of communications. We rotated that officer every shift hour, which I think was every 2 hours. And somebody said, we want name the radio operator by name. And I said, where is he? He's outside. He'd been asleep on a haystack, and now we need him in here. I said, well, don't you bother about it. I'll go on out and I'll get him. He was one of my radio operators. I knew him very well. And I went out and I reached over, shook him awake, and he was lying on top of his rifle butt with his leg over the rifle butt. And at that point, something moved. I have very good vision. I can see that finger wiggling. And out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. And as I followed it, it turned out to be a German 100 millimeter shell. It came down, it hit my radio operator on the thigh, shattered the rifle butt behind him, went into the haystack, and bounced about 10 feet away. If that thing had been live, I would be dead. And but I'm alive. And the thing was a dud. It had actually hit on a hedgerow about 100 yards away, torn off the fuse somehow so that the fuse wouldn't work, and then come spinning end over end and finally hit the man's leg. And we had to evacuate him, but he came back. We were still at Brest. The Germans had surrendered, and we were starting to move the battalion out. I was made the forward party. In other words, my job was to get to the destination as quickly as I could, lay it out to receive the battalion so that they would know that A company is here, B company, and let the company commanders arrange their own companies, but you place them. So I started out, and the MPs were godsends. The MPs knew where every unit was located, where I could get water, where I could get gasoline, where I could get medical assistance, where I could get anything that I needed, but mostly all, how to get away from those monsters who drove the Red Ball Highway. All of our supplies had to be moved by truck, and they created a highway called the Red Ball. And if you got on the Red Ball, those trucks went by you at 65 or 70 miles an hour. And we weren't allowed to drive that fast, so I could stay off the Red Ball Highway and a whole bunch of other things. And I remember receiving directions. Now, when you're going along this particular road, do not take the left fork under any circumstances. The Germans are up the left fork. Take the right fork, and Americans are up there. So we were driving along. It was already dark, and we hadn't seen any right or left fork or anything like that. It was dark, and I said, we were headed up a hill, and I said to my driver, stop this thing. This feels like I'm on the left fork. And he said, no, there wasn't any left fork. I said, well, just stop. I want to look around. Going up a hill was described and a few things like that. And the other road was going down the hill, the one we're supposed to be on. So he stopped, and it's pitch black. I get out of the Jeep. I move forward to the front right bumper, and there in front of me, and I could see it when I got up to it, there was enough starlight and things around that I could see a 50-foot crater that the Germans had blown in the road. Needless to say, we backed up quickly and got back to the right fork and got through.
Now, your time at the Bulge was cut short
Yeah,
due to an injury in an accident, correct?
right.
Tell me what happened there.
Well, the Bulge started on December 16th. We had been in this particular area fighting the Germans for at least a week. And what we had been able to do, we were able to send out long-range patrols, which would go through the German lines and find a woods, camp out in the woods, and then practically put the bumper markings down on a piece of paper of every German truck that went by, including what its cargo was, if it were apparent what the cargo was. All of this was very successful. The Allied headquarters couldn't have been happier because they were receiving real-time information about real German units, who was there and what they were doing, what they were carrying. On December 16th, our patrols went out. They couldn't put a tiny dent in the German line. The Germans had filled all the gaps, and they were unable to get through. When we reported that back to Corps headquarters, they said, something's happening. We don't know what it is. And by the way, we were way south of the Bulge. When I say way south, we were not involved in the Battle of the Bulge. We were south of that. We were told to use what's known as a box barrage to seal off a small company of Germans with artillery on both sides and in back of them. All what we call time on target. All the shell were fired so they arrived simultaneously to form this boundary of the box. And the instant that happened, 2 Ranger companies assaulted the Germans caught in the box. And they came out. They were told to come out with an officer. They came out with a German major, and with no casualties on our part. But we knew something was up. We turned the German major over to Corps Intelligence, and that's the way it went. We never heard again. Some 6 days later, we received marching orders, and during the execution of those marching orders, I had to go from forward headquarters to rear headquarters, and in the process, had a bumper-to-bumper crash with one of my own vehicles, a radio vehicle that was going forward to serve the forward headquarters with a big radio. So that was the end of my war. I had the $1 million wound, although it did take me till February to get home.
This is the final question on D-Day. What do you generally think of film depictions of D-Day, like The Longest Day? And
Okay. I love The Longest Day. I didn't like their coverage of Rangers. It was one case of pseudo General Coda saying, "Get me the Ranger commander here." That's the only thing they mention Rangers on. But I understood that. He had a big story to tell. And he put things in the wrong places. He put things in the wrong times and things like that. But generally speaking, it did tell a fairly accurate story of the invasion. And it put faces on the people who served during that time. General Roosevelt, General Coda, General Gerhardt, and so on. It was good entertainment, but it was not an historical document because he had to rearrange things to fit his story that he wanted to tell. But I liked it, and it was sufficiently accurate for students to see and get their information on. Private Raaen was 100% fictitious, but it did portray more realistically than The Longest Day. It did portray the things that I was interested in far, far better. It had some crass errors in it, and then it had the same problem. They had to fit the Rangers into a story that was already written, and there was no Ranger outfit to do it. So they picked the nearest one, C Company of the 2nd Battalion, and had them land in a different place under different circumstances and things. But the battle scenes of Private Raaen were very, very good, but nowhere near as good as the battle scenes in Band of Brothers. Band of Brothers made me feel I was back in battle again. Long periods of waiting, then intense pictures of horror. They really hit it on the nose in the Band of Brothers. So if anybody wants to see what combat is like, they look at Band of Brothers.